if you're just overwhelmed with tactical decisions, the day-to-day operations that, again, are not things that in isolation are huge issues, but if that is something that is becoming overwhelming in the day-to-day life of a farm manager, I think that that's a sign that things are getting pretty complex and could be cutting into profits.
Is bigger always better? When it comes to family farms, it can be tempting to think that expansion and growth are the best paths to profit. But at what point does growth create more problems than it solves? We'll explore next. From the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, this is Nebraska Farmcast. Thank you for listening again to Nebraska Farmcast from the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Find the center's farm and ranch management resources like articles, webinars, decision tools, and more at cap.unl.edu. I'm Ryan Evans with the Center for Ag Profitability. Whether it's adding acres, expanding a cattle herd, or investing in more equipment, family farms sometimes believe that growing their operation will translate to improved profitability. But is bigger always better? Tim Meyer, a professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics here at Nebraska, wrote a recent Cornhusker Economics article on diseconomies of scale, looking at when growth might actually hurt efficiency, profitability, or management of a farm. I'm glad to welcome him back to the podcast to discuss the article and why it's worth considering that growth isn't always a path to profitability. Tim, thanks for being here again.
You bet.
So what do you mean, or what do economists mean by diseconomies of scale, and how might that apply to family farms here in the state?
Yeah, so it's the opposite of economies of scale, where expansion lowers our cost of production. If we have diseconomies of scale, then the average cost per unit actually is going to rise, or our cash break even is going to be higher.
And you mentioned in your article that conversations with students can often reflect the attitudes of producers across Nebraska, since many of those students do come from family farms. So do they bring up often that idea that getting bigger is the key to success and profitability?
They do bring it up pretty frequently, and they're not wrong. But the idea that getting bigger always leads to greater profits isn't ubiquitous. Like most things on the farm, it's usually more complicated. So it's a delicate balance of helping them realize their experience is valuable, but then showing them the nuances of how the production of farm products works.
And yeah, like you said, it can certainly be a true statement, right? That growing can lead to more success.
Yeah, of course. An example would be a really small producer on this side of the state. They might have half a section or 320 acres. If they have a full equipment line and they're producing, if they had the opportunity to rent or buy a quarter section that was adjacent to them, they could spread those fixed costs out amongst obviously 50% more production, and that's going to lower their cost of production, and which will lead to a direct increase in profits.
Yeah, but it makes sense that it's probably risky to assume that's true all the time, that growth equals more profitability, more success. So what are some examples of situation where growing can actually make things harder or less efficient for a family operation, say?
A lot of it boils down to the limited time and effort that the manager has to make decisions. So, they just can't be everywhere at all times. So what do you do if you can't be everywhere at all times? You have to hire employees. And when you start hiring more employees, the principal agent problem becomes real. So the idea is the employee making the decisions to maximize their own well-being. They might not want to work very hard. Are they taking care of equipment? Are they safe? Are they doing things that are going to, keep them accident free? And so when you start having these discussions, the idea of an HR department becomes a reality. And that obviously is something that's going to add cost.
And then what about when it comes to management choices related to things like labor, decision-making in leadership positions, or oversight? How does that become more complicated and maybe more expensive as farms expand?
The management choices that you're making even simple things on the physical production side become more difficult, like the logistics of planting and harvesting, crop management. The opportunity to make mistakes becomes larger. So if it's pest control, again, that person can't be everywhere at all times. And so how are you going to manage those things that, are simple from just if I'm isolating the one thing, but now because it's over such a larger operation, it's not so easy any longer.
Are there other hidden costs that can eat away at profitability when farms scale up?
Yeah. So, there could even be the possibility that procuring enough inputs becomes an issue, or relying on specific vendors is now risky. Everything we've talked about costs money. And the input that will stay scarce for most family farms, no matter how big they get, is labor. And so, looking at how does our revenue per person, sometimes our metrics are telling us the wrong thing. If revenue per person is getting really, really high, we say, well, we're using our labor very effectively, but it also could be saying that there's not enough labor to manage everything that's going on.
And are there other signs for producers who are listening that they might be experiencing diseconomies of scale?
That's a tough one. And I thought about actually just kind of a general feeling. If you're looking at decisions that used to be simple and they are no longer, I think that's a sign. If you're just overwhelmed with tactical decisions, the day-to-day operations that, again, are not things that in isolation are huge issues. But if that is something that is becoming overwhelming in the day-to-day life of a farm manager, I think that that's a sign that things are getting pretty complex and could be cutting into profits.
So how should farmers, ranchers think about balancing growth with efficiency and sustainability when they're planning for the future of the operation?
Well, they need to look for opportunities to expand that don't require huge investments. In the article I wrote about having 4 kids, and you send them all to the University of Nebraska. And, I'm a little biased. I think they, should see us in the ag econ department every semester. But it would be good to have an irrigation specialist. It would be good to have an equipment manager. It would be good to have an agronomist. And so we have to be smart about how we're expanding, how we're utilizing the labor and the skills and the resources that we have, so that we can kind of maintain a sweet spot of the size of the operation. Lastly, if we're going to think about that family operation, I wrote in the article about if you go to a big city, you can see 3 Starbucks at the same time.
Right.
We can do that on the farm too. It's just called replication. And we replicate the size of the production plant that is most efficient. And I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to have 4 kids, but we have other partnerships and mergers and ways that we can take advantage of economies of scale where they're there and avoid the pitfalls of diseconomies of scale.
That's Tim Meyer, professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And you can find his article on diseconomies of scale for family farms in the notes to this podcast. And I've also shared it on the Center for Ag Profitability's website at cap.unl.edu. Tim, thanks a lot.
You bet, Ryan. Anytime.
Thank you very much for listening to Nebraska Farmcast, a production of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm Ryan Evans, and you can find a host of farm and ranch management resources, including articles, decision tools, videos, and more on the Center for Agricultural Profitability's website, cap.unl.edu.